Hi guys, welcome to another Monday night study. One of the things that I've been working on going through the scrolls is trying to learn a lot about them, and we've been working recently the past few months recreating their Old Testament Bible, and as we figured it would turn out to be almost identical with ours, and we're still missing parts, which just means we haven't found the parts. It doesn't mean that they didn't have them. Looking at everything we have about 40% of the Old Testament, more or less, in just manuscripts that are Bible based. And then when you pull quotes from studies, from commentaries, from prophecy studies, from history, some things like that, it actually adds quite a bit more into it. Some of them are already there, and some of them are parts we're missing. And so we're actually up to around 60% or so of that group. So that's what we've been working on. So in the past, when we started doing this, I've been working on this not quite 3 years now, and I have put together the Testaments of the Patriarchs, which is supposed to be the last will and testament of the Patriarchs from Adam to Aaron, and other people that ran the school of the prophets. They considered that authoritative in how you interpret the Old Testament, whereas the Pharisees considered what they called the oral Torah to be how you interpret the Old Testament. And you and I wouldn't know who's who if they're both lying or one's correct, except we now as Christians interpret the Old Testament by what the New Testament says. So if you compare New Testament theology, half of what the Pharisees say is true, but there's a good portion of it that's not. You go to the Essene camp, and it's all identical with Christian theology. So that makes us want to look at the Testaments of the Patriarchs, because they teach first coming prophecy and some second coming. So we put that out as a book. Then we did the calendar, because that was extremely important. I didn't know why, but in going through their writings, they said it's extremely important. So it took us a good over a year just to figure it out, and I couldn't come up with it. I just couldn't figure it out myself, even though now that I understand it, it's actually pretty simple. It was just too complex for me. But thanks to a lot of people pulling the scrolls together, other pieces of it, we finally were able to piece it together. And so now we're working on the prophecy part, the commentaries. And this morning I was thinking about the herbal medicine. And I know it's kind of not appropriate to talk about anything that is medicine-like or herbs or whatever on Facebook or YouTube or whatever, because they tend to not like that. But we don't really have enough to talk about that in that way. All we have is quotes about certain books, and we have one little piece of that book, of one of those books. And then we have a lot of other stuff. But I thought about the prophecy books that they have and pulling all the prophecies together about end time prophecy. And I was putting it together this morning, and I didn't realize there's actually quite a bit about health as far as end time stuff goes. And so let's start by looking at this, for instance. And I want to show you one of those today, and we're going to look at it. In the Old Testament, when you go to Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 10, we always go there and we look at the genealogies. Adam was 130 when Seth was born. Seth was so many years old when Enos was born. And you go on down and you realize that if you count those up, the flood was 1,656 years after creation. And then you go on. Abraham was born in 1948, 1,948 years after creation. And you can create a timeline like this, and that's wonderful. That's important for a lot of prophecies in a lot of ways. But one thing we don't realize is when you go back and you look at that, the average person lived to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 years is what it looks like. A lot of them did pre-flood. And then I've mentioned before, as soon as you get post-flood, you have the people that were born pre-flood that went post-flood. Noah lived most of his life, 600 years, in the pre-flood world. Now, we don't know what the atmosphere was for sure, what kind of food they, how it, under that atmospheric pressure, what the food did, how much vitamins and, that. But somehow they were around 900. So Noah comes through the flood into pretty much this atmosphere, not this much pollution, but basically over here, lives another 300 years. So he's still living 900-ish, having been born and spent most of his life pre-flood. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, there's legends about them. The only one we really know for sure is Shem. Shem lives to be 600 and dies 600 some. And so, but he's through the flood. Now, the people born over here, okay, or born on this side of the flood, the first 4 generations, and you can just see this by looking at Genesis, they lived to be around 400-ish, more or less. And then something happens, and again, it's not recorded what, but something with the atmosphere or food or something. And it cuts the lifespan in half again. So 4 generations into this, all of a sudden now, people live to 200-ish, and that's about it. And there are different stories, like with Nimrod and his group, trying to find people that are in their 400s, or maybe finding Noah and trying to figure out how in the world they lived that long. Are they sorcerers, or, what's the deal? So there's things like that. But so this aging process has been going down for whatever reason. It's been speculated the canopy had twice as much atmospheric pressure as we have today. That would definitely increase health. I don't know if it would double a lifespan, but it would increase your health and do a lot of different things. Of course, it would also change a lot of things in the plants and the foods that we would have been eating back then. And so lots of stuff like that. The Essenes were known to live around 120 years. So that was pretty old for that time period. All of the Gentile nations, and including the Sadducees and the Pharisees, lived to be on average 55, 60-ish. So if you think about this, and I've tried to figure this out as far as herbal medicine goes, the Jews ate kosher, the Gentiles ate non-kosher. As far as Pharisees, Sadducees, and Romans, they all have the same lifespan. So it's not just eating kosher anyway. That might have been a small part of it, but it didn't seem to do much for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But now the Essenes, obviously being Jewish, are not eating the Roman diet. So they're eating kosher, like the Pharisees and Sadducees. So they're eating the same Jewish diet. But in addition to that, and that may or may not make a difference, they have herbal medicine, which they talk about herbal medicine books and other things. Who knows what else it was. And they seem to have a report of living extremely long lifespans. They're known to be healers. And of course, part of that is that they're prophets also. And so if the Spirit of God is on them and they lay hands on you and pray for you, you might be healed in that way. But they were also known to be herbal doctors. So a combination of being godly, eating right, herbal medicine, faith healing, maybe living in Qumran in the desert area, although that wouldn't be it for them because it's always been that way for them. Again, it's got something to do with the atmospheric pressure and all sorts of stuff. But with that in mind, some of the texts talk about that continuing to get worse. Oh, well, the main thing I wanted to mention, that's all stuff we've talked about before. But going back to Genesis 5 and 10, one of the things you notice is the pre-flood people, they die around 900. They also marry about 135. Now, if you think about it, we tell our kids to wait till like they're at least 20. So at least they've had some schoolings, hopefully went to college, able to make a good living. Then you can get married, then you can have kids, and you won't have a hard time. It'll be much easier on you. So do what you want, but just make sure you're prepared first, okay? And like a 12 or 13-year-old kid would be a girl giving birth. That's kind of dangerous. You want to wait till you're at least 18 or 20 to give birth. It's just not a good idea on your biology. So if you think about this, if they got married, there's no sense of getting married if you haven't went through puberty yet, right? If that makes sense. There's just no, even if you were an adult and somehow, like what I'm trying to say is, if you look at that and they got married around 130 to 135 and they died around 900, it's almost like that's just an expanded life form or lifespan. So today, we would be doing good if we lived to be 90, right? So when is puberty? 12, 13, something like that. So if our 13-year-olds would not have a hard pregnancy, we're married, we're mature enough and adult enough, and could take care of themselves, they had enough money coming in, they could make a good life, there's no reason to wait. So, and that's not possible today. But what I'm saying is that's probably why you can see once they hit puberty at 135, then go ahead and get married. You're ready. You've got all this, cattle, and you're wealthy, and grab someone, get married, have a family. So if you replicate that back, 135 for puberty, get married and have kids, and then 900 dying, and you run all that stuff back to 13 and 90, it fits on a pattern. Well, there are some texts that talk about at the end of the age, several things happening, and we're going to look at one or two of those today. One of them is that you give birth at 4 months, and it seems to be not at 4 months, we can barely make the baby survive through medical type stuff. That might be what we're referring to. And that's why I always keep checking with the pro-life groups, because they talk about, don't abort the child, because the child could live at 7 months. And then it became they can live pretty almost guaranteed, unless there's something major wrong, if they were born premature at 6 months. And now they're talking about 5.5 months. It's pretty iffy still, but they can survive. So they're just trying to use that as a point that we should be pro-life. Well, somewhere along the line, it gets down to 4 months. So I thought that was interesting. So I'm thinking maybe it's just our technology getting better and better and better. But the text also talks about, if I remember correctly, and I have to look this up, this one that I don't have, but one of the texts had something about giving birth at like 9 or 10, and instead of 13-ish. That's knocking it back a little bit. It also talked about graying at like 20. So if you think about it, now today, forgetting about the reproduction, but when you grow like gray, like I am with a gray beard, if this happens to me when I'm 40 to 50, and I live to be 90, this is an indication my life is half over, or something like that, 2/3, somewhere around there. So if you can have a baby at 4 months, and that's unheard of now, and get pregnant earlier and gray at 20, that would almost indicate death rates are like 40 to 50. So it looks like something happens to the world as a whole that kind of shrinks that down again. So that's one of the signs that several of these scrolls talk about. Now, granted, these scrolls, some of them, the ones from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can say, I think those are pretty well exactly what they mean. If they're talked about or fragmented and we get other pieces from the Greek, from the Ethiopic or whatever, it may be correct. It may have been mistranslated over the centuries, hopping through different languages. So we want to give the Dead Sea Scrolls the most credit. The other text, we want to look at them and just kind of see what we come up with. So I went back. I was going to put together all those different things, and I found something, and I totally forgot about this, but there's this text in the Ezra Apocalypse, and let me just explain what that is. It's not a Dead Sea Scroll, but it is an early church work. I shouldn't say that either. Supposedly, if you believe the text, it's a prophetic book like Daniel's Prophecies, the Book of Daniel. This is a book from Ezra the prophet, or Ezra, the same guy, Ezra and Nehemiah, that started everything. He wrote Ezra and supposedly wrote the Ezra Apocalypse, which contains prophecy. Now, it may be added to, it might be garbled. We've done a translation of it because it contains the prophecy of the dragon nations, which is the rise of Islam, and the formation of the end time false church. That's got a little bit of information in that. It also talks about the split of the Roman Empire and is extremely accurate in what it says. The oldest copy of this we have is in the 200s AD. So like before, like with the Testaments of the Patriarchs, the earliest copy we had is medieval. It sounds too good to be true, so it probably is. It's probably fiction. But then we found copies of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we know the legends of them getting it in Hebrew from caves up in Judea somewhere were real. And so that gives it a whole new light to study. We don't know that the Ezra Apocalypse has been tampered with or whatever. We don't have any kind of an original Hebrew. But we have the church fathers, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, other people quoting the legend that only is given in the Ezra Apocalypse, which is the closing of the canon. So supposedly under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Ezra closed the canon, the Old Testament canon. Now, he also made sure that they had a copy of the canon in Aramaic. And of course, Hebrew is the original real one, but Aramaic is the common language of the people. He also made sure they had copies of the additional 70 books, which are history, prophecy, chronology, different things, but it's not the public canon. And so that's kind of where we get this idea of extra biblical books. But we don't ever add anything to the Old Testament. Likewise, and I'm not sure who did this, but somewhere along the line, a prophet closed the New Testament canon. So we have 39 in the way we count the books, 39 in the Old, 27 in the New. So that doesn't mean that the patriarchal writings are wrong. It's kind of a pre-Mosaic canon, but you don't add them to the Old Testament. When the Messiah comes and the millennial reign is here, I fully expect somebody to write a "this is how it was fulfilled" text. And I would, assume that would be a millennial canon. So I don't think the canon as itself is over, or I really think we're probably missing part of the story. But the basic Christian teaching is still the same. You don't add to the Old Testament and you don't add to the New Testament, that's how we got our 400 silent years. How in the world did we get from Jews being brothers to Pharisees and Sadducees trying to kill each other? Well, you're missing the story. So we need that story. It's very important. We need the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we don't add them to the canon. But it's always interesting when I see the church fathers, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and anybody else who's out there saying, "Oh yeah, that happened." And so the Pharisees, the only difference is they would say that the patriarchal testaments that the Essenes have were fiction. The old ones, nobody knows what happened to them. That's really convenient when our great-grandfathers tell us what's going to happen with Messiah, and you want it to be a different story. Oh yeah, that's fiction. I don't know what happened to the real ones. And again, we wouldn't know that except the New Testament. So that's pretty cool. Okay, well, anyway, with that in mind, let's look at this. And I thought this was pretty interesting. One of the, in case we don't get to it, I think we should. It should be in there. Okay, let me bring this up over here. So this is the Ancient Apocalypse of Ezra. And again, the oldest copy is 200 AD. So it's not in a lot of ancient Greek manuscripts. It has been floating around. It's been considered canon in, I think, Syrian and one of the other, at least Syrian and one other Orthodox group. You know how the Catholics have Apocrypha, and then the Orthodox usually have the Roman Catholic Apocrypha, but they usually have an extra book or two, and they're all different. The Syrians would have an extra book, and the Ethiopians would have an extra book, and stuff like that. Anyway, the story behind this, but just a little bit of history before we go forward. As far as the Apocalypse of Ezra, it's called Second Esdras in the King James 1611. Now, as you will remember, when the King James was put together, they were putting Bibles together, right? So the first really good translation that had good notes in it, almost the very first study Bible, so to speak, is the Geneva. But the study notes were not just notes that were correct, but they were opinions, which may or may not be correct. So some of the opinions were how evil the Roman Catholic Church is, and the Pope might be the Antichrist, and that kind of stuff. So it was extremely anti-Roman Catholic. Well, at that point then, what the Catholics did, they commissioned, or one of the popes commissioned, what became eventually the Reims Douay Bible, first the New Testament and the Old Testament. And it's basically the same translation. If you look at the Reims Douay and you look at the Geneva and you look at the King James, the text is almost identical. There's a few things that you would need to look at, but pretty close actually. But it's more of the study Bible notes. So the study Bible notes in the Reims Douay, as you can imagine, are extremely anti-Protestant. Okay, and so then comes the King James. So King James ordered the creation of a new Bible. He put Roman Catholic scholars and Protestant scholars on it. They pulled it together, and again, it's pretty much like the Geneva. It's basically just that text, very little change. He allowed notes to be put to it, like if you didn't know where Jerusalem was, you might have a footnote saying Jerusalem is a city in Israel. It's located, 20 miles west of whatever. So that kind of stuff, things that nobody would debate. Okay, so all the inflammatory notes out. No Reims Douay notes, no Geneva notes, just a King James. But this is what's interesting. So we all agree on an Old Testament and a New Testament, but the Roman Catholics also want the Apocrypha. Well, the Protestants don't want the Apocrypha. So what's not really recognized is the compromise that was made amongst them. And I don't know if it was more or less an order or what, but the parts that the Protestants don't like, Roman Catholic Apocrypha, are moved to the center. And you can remember this. If you can go back and find a 1611 King James, it will have the Apocrypha in it. So you'll have the Old Testament, the Apocrypha in the middle, and then the New Testament. What's interesting and what's kind of overlooked is that in the King James Apocrypha is the Ezra Apocalypse, or it's called Second Ezra's. You won't find that in a Roman Catholic Bible. So basically what had happened is they all agreed to put the Old Testament and the New Testament in there, and the Roman Catholic Apocrypha, and Second Ezra's. Second Ezra's, if we could say this, is an Anglican Apocrypha. Now again, none of this is inside the Old Testament or the New Testament, so it shouldn't be added to the canon, and according to what we're learning from the scrolls. But it may contain real history. It may contain real prophecy. It just shouldn't be in the canon. But notice what's happening here. Why did the Anglicans, in their compromise, say, okay, we'll have Old Testament, New Testament. We all agree on that. The Protestants don't like the Apocrypha, but the Catholics do. We'll put in the Apocrypha and the Ezra Apocalypse. Well, one thing that most people don't realize is when you get to one part of the Ezra Apocalypse, there is a prophecy about the formation of what's probably Roman Catholicism. And it ends up being prophetic of not directly, but connected to the Babylonian mystery religion and mentioned in Revelation. So you can understand why no Catholic Bible would have this in there. It's somewhat anti-Roman Catholic, or could be. I mean, you could always interpret it a different way, I suppose. But it's interesting that they put that in there. And the parts that talk about the Roman Empire division and that kind of stuff, again, are absolutely perfect from 325 to 476. The prophecies are accurate. And again, if we have copies of this going back to 200 AD, the prophecies were between 395 and 476. That's prophecy. It'd be really hard to get around that. So anyway, let me just go through with this And so in other words, since this is not a Dead Sea Scroll, it may have errors in it. Okay, I tried really hard to get the text as what we have, but the text that we have may be correct. You never know on that. I've mentioned before, like in Jubilees. Jubilees has probably some really great text, maybe nothing wrong doctrinally, maybe not, but the numbers are off. You start adding up Adam, Seth, Enos down to Noah, and that kind of stuff. You'll come down and get 300 years off. And then all of a sudden it starts going back. So when you get from creation to Jacob, birth or death, I forget which one, it's only off by 1 year compared to Genesis. So if you compare it, I mean, no matter who's right or wrong, how could you get 300 years off and then come 300 years back? Obviously, the Jubilees number system is off, not anything else, especially when you've got multiple text and lots of other places that agree with the Hebrew Genesis. So anyway, so take everything with a grain of salt. But we go through here, and it's really got some interesting things about morality and true believers and the Messiah. So there's prophecies about when Messiah comes, what he would be like, and the sin nature, different things like that. The riddle of time, that's a really cool one we need to look at sometime. But anyway, we get to chapter 5. It's got last days signs, and then it continues it in chapter 6. And chapter 6 is where we want to look at. And I want to show you this. It basically starts out saying God's in control and things will be, evil people will be destroyed and his righteous will be saved. And, you know, and the prophet is going to say, like, I believe that, but it sure doesn't look like that now. When are these things going to happen? Or when is this, you know, this kind of stuff? So let me look at this. This is pretty cool. This is, the sinners get destroyed, etc. Abraham is the key to dividing the ages. Now, I put this together. Of course, all these texts are mine. It's basically what the paragraph's going to say. But when I put this together and published it, it was several years back. It's before I understood the ages properly, and before the calendar came out, so I didn't understand the calendar. So I looked at this and I thought, I don't quite get it, but okay, fine, I'll just put it down, go on, and we'll figure it out later. But remember from the calendar studies that the ages, the time of man is divided into 3 ages. There's the age of creation, the age of Torah, and the age of grace. Each one is supposed to be 2,000 years apiece. Then there is a millennial reign. And that's what the ritual of the Sabbath is supposed to teach us. Work 6 days, take a day off. That kind of a prophetic teaching. And then in each one of these ages, there are 4 500-year periods, which we call them sub-ages or onas. And the Dead Sea Scroll writers always talked about the fact that they're in age 8, which means ona 8. We're in 12. So if we can find out prophecies talking about the 12th age, for instance, or the end of that age, that would be right about now. So very interesting. And it's really cool to look at the end of the 8th age or period, because that's all about the end of their time and the first coming of Messiah. So really interesting. But anyway, each one of these periods then is a 500-year period. And in that section then, that's 10 Jubilees. A Jubilee is a 50-year period in this, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the 50-year period is divided into 7 sets of 7 years called Shemitahs, and then a 1-year Jubilee period. And that's how they kept time in sets of Jubilees. So you'll find prophecies, for instance, about this is what happened in the last, in the 8th age, and they had it lined up Jubilee by Jubilee, Ona by Ona. Well, it's all one Ona, but that last Jubilee of their age, all the Shemitahs and the lined up and who did what. And so again, just like us putting it was 1955, because it'd be like decades and centuries. So really interesting. But anyway, so with that in mind, the end of the first age is when Abraham was here fighting against Nimrod. Nimrod was an antichrist figure with a one world empire and a one world religion who had a false prophet, that would be Anuki, in the other manuscripts that told all the details of the wars and gave the dates and all that kind of stuff. So that's really interesting. So the text then says that Abraham was called of God when he was 52. And if you add that up, if he was born in 1948, add 52 years to it, that'd be the year 2000. That should be the end of the age, end of the first age, beginning of the second. So now he's going to take Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and create the Jewish nation. And then later on, through that Jewish nation, the Messiah would come, actually at the end of the next age, So lots of time to go through. So look at this then. He's talking about people being punished and the Lord coming and setting up the kingdom and things getting righteousness. And he asked this question. And this is, let me see if we can do that just a little bit better. There we go. He says, "Then I answered and said, what is the dividing apart of the times?" So how do you divide the times, figure out what's going to happen when, and this kind of stuff? So that's fine. But look what he says here. And this surprised me. I remember doing this, but I didn't connect it. I didn't even capitalize the age because I didn't realize the age is a thing, that should be capitalized. So what is the dividing of the times, or what is the end of the first age? He actually understood that. So we would know that to be 2000 when Abraham was 52, right? Okay, so it goes on and says, and what is the beginning of the second? Well, the end of the first age is the beginning of the second. Well, unless there's a gap. So it all depends on exactly what we're talking about. Now, number-wise, there's no gap between 1920 and 1921 or 2020 and 2021. There's no gap. But if the nation of Israel is supposed to start about now, there are people beginning it 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. It won't, even if it's, 1948 when they said Israel is a state, it may not be totally solidified as a country that couldn't be destroyed, for another 10, 20 years. So it's always a process. But look what he says. He actually answers him. So when did the first age end and the second age begin? Kind of important. He said to me, from Abraham until Isaac, when Jacob and Esau were born to him, and Jacob caught his heel and some other stuff. So there's a secondary prophecy in here. But we think about this when we talk about generations. We're talking about the time. My generation is from the time I was born to the time I had my firstborn son. Okay, so Abraham lives to be 99 years old, and then Isaac's born. Then it's the time of Isaac. Abraham lives another 76 years after that. He's still around, but it's not the time of Abraham, it's the time of Isaac. Whenever Isaac has Jacob and Esau, then Isaac's time is over. And he may live a long time after that, but that's how you count the generations. So Abraham being born, and then Abraham having Isaac 99 years. So it's basically 100 cut in half. So that would be basically 50. So I think it's interesting that he's saying here, give or take a year, in the middle of Abraham's age, when Abraham gives it over to Isaac. That's the end of the first age, beginning of the second. Well, Genesis-wise, that's correct. That would be the year 1999 or 2000. And that's when the age, of course, and then there's some time between Jacob and Esau when things actually get started. So the covenant's given with Abraham, turned around and re-given to Isaac, turned around and re-given to Jacob, and it actually starts with Jacob. But the actual end of the age is the middle of the time from Abraham to Isaac. I just thought that was really interesting. So he gives us the answer in such a way as it doesn't help him a whole lot to figure out what he's wanting to know. It'd be like us saying, so exactly when is the rapture? Well, I'll tell you, kind of. It's before the tribulation, and then he ends. So this kind of a thing. So this is interesting. So coming back here, he's talking about God being in control, and Abraham is the key to dividing the ages. And so this is interesting. So I've got a footnote here about when Jacob and Esau were born in 2108 AM. So it was 100 years later after the end of the age. But this is the beginning of another prophecy. So then he gives a petition to understand more prophecy. So he begins to say, okay, good start, but can I understand a little more? And so let me find, this chapter 6. I want to get down to verse 20. There's several things in here, but I'll just start with 17 here. There's the aging prophecy, which I want to get to. So he asks him about this. He gives him kind of an answer, and he says, when I heard it, I stood to my feet. I heard the voice of one speaking to me, and his voice was at the sound of many waters. Sounds familiar. The voice said, behold, this is the answer to his one of his questions. Behold, the days to come, when I begin to draw nigh to visit those who dwell upon the earth. Now understand, the Dead Sea Scrolls teach that there's times of what they call visitation. And it's not necessarily the end of everything, because there was a visitation when Christ came the first time. There'll be a visitation when Christ comes the second time. And there will be a visitation of God at the end of the millennial reign. And there apparently was a visitation with Abraham. And if you also consider that God maybe Jesus doesn't come to earth or something, but a judgment of some sort, I would definitely call the destruction of the flood of the first part of the first age, the first 3/4 of it, a visitation. God made a visitation. So visitations are different things, but which one are we talking about? So the voice said, when I begin to draw nigh to visit those who dwell upon the earth, that sounds like when Jesus' first or second coming, when I am about to judge the unjust and the unrighteous, when they afflict Zion, it will be fulfilled. Okay, that's probably not the first coming. It's probably the second coming. Okay, Jesus is coming and fulfilling prophecy, but it's to judge this time. Remember, Jesus said, I've come not to judge, I've come to fulfill prophecy. Next time he comes to judge. So we're talking about the second coming of some sort. Rapture, tribulation, second coming era, time period. This gets really interesting. So when that happens, he says, when it's about to be fulfilled, and when this world is about to be sealed, which is about to pass away, these signs will I do. Now, before we get into the signs, let's look at what this is saying here. We're told in the New Testament, for instance, when you become a believer, you're sealed with the Holy Spirit. It's like, okay, it's a done deal. So if you become a Christian, there's nothing that Satan can do to undo what Christ did on the cross, to make it to where all Christians go to hell now. It just doesn't happen. Christ paid the penalty. It's a done deal. It's sealed. So we become a Christian and we're sealed in him. In this case, that's a good thing. But in this case, another sealing, and we use it in English a lot, their fate is sealed. And it just means it's a done deal. But usually that's used in a context of it's not very good. You're going to be executed and your fate is sealed, and that's all there is to it. That kind of thing. And so this is what's happening. So he's going to come and judge the earth and the unrighteous, and it's when the world is about to be sealed. Okay, and we understand during the tribulation period, the massive destruction and the recreation that's going on. So when that's, and everything is about to pass away, like Peter says, with fervent heat. So these signs will I do. Now, before I get to the signs, I always thought, well, this could be about now, or how, because we're not that far away from the tribulation period, I don't think. I don't think it's another 50, 100, well, maybe 50, but not another 100, 200 years. If the second coming is the year 6000, The modern Jewish calendar would have it 200 years from now. The Essene calendar would have it 54 years from now. But the rapture, if that's what we're talking about, is at least 7 or more years before that. And of course, it may be even shorter than that. But this is what happened. There's certain prophecies that happen. But let me skip over that for now. We'll come right back to it. And this is what happens. But notice what happens at this point. So he begins to move and judge the earth. That sounds like the tribulation. And then after the judgment, something happens. It'll be the setting up of the kingdom. But notice what it says. This is pretty interesting. The trumpet will sound, scaring everyone who hears it. That could be second coming. It could be a bunch of stuff. Depends on what trumpet. At that time, friends will war with friends as enemies. Nation fighting against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And the earth will stand in fear of them. So there's some specific countries we need to be watching out for. Springs and fountains will stand still for 3 hours. That sounds weird at first, but when you realize that can happen easily with earthquakes, it's another way of saying many earthquakes. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see it, but sometimes you'll have a river, a big river even, running down this way. And right here, there's an earthquake, and all the waters, go down until the earth comes back. And so if you're a ways away from that, one of the things you can actually see is you'll feel the earthquake, and then you'll actually see the water that's always running this way, all of a sudden running back the other way. Or maybe it's stationary. But especially if it starts running back the other way, that's something to get a picture of. The Nile River running backwards, that kind of thing. But then it fixes itself, because as soon as the earthquake is over, eventually the water coming down continues and it goes back to normal. Anyway, so earthquakes. Everyone, now look at this. This is cool. Everyone who survives all these things, which I have told you. So if you see the tribulation period and you make it all the way through, you'd be one of those people that enter the millennial reign. So everyone who survives enters the millennial reign, okay? Makes it to the second coming, in other words. If they actually survives all this stuff we've talked about in the previous chapters, you will escape and see my deliverance and the end of the age, end of the world, or the end of that age. That makes sense. That's probably the year 6000. But notice this. Then the men who have been taken up, who have not tasted death since their birth, will see it, and the heart of the inhabitants of the earth will be transformed and changed into a different mind. The sin nature is not completely eradicated, but changed in some way. And it goes on and talks about other things. So there's a group of people that were taken off of the planet before the destruction came. And if you're here and you see that destruction and somehow live through the whole thing, you will see the end of the age, and you will see those people return with Messiah. Well, that's the second coming, obviously. But this is talking about the rapture. I mean, there's no way around that. There's a group of people. It's plural. It's not just two guys like the two witnesses. But it's a group of people, men, who have been taken up. And even if you think it's two people would be enough instead of dual or plural in Hebrew, they have not tasted death since their birth. So the two witnesses haven't died, obviously, but they come back and then they do die, lay in the street for 3 days, 3.5 days, and are taken up, resurrected and taken up. So by this time, if we're talking about the second coming, they've died. So there's a group of people that have never seen death, but they have been taken up and they come back. So there's no way around this but the rapture. So the reason I bring this into you, this part here, is because we're talking about when the end begins, I begin to judge the peoples. Apparently, he takes a group of people away. That's a pre-trib rapture. And then this judgment comes. And then we come back and the kingdom is set up. So the prophecy that I wanted to show you, I've always wondered when it would be, and I just somehow never put two and two together. Apparently, this happens during the tribulation period. Because I've always looked at that like if that's going to happen, that's going to take a while. I don't know how it could happen even in like 10 years or so, or maybe, who knows, but it just seems like that's pushing the rapture, a century or two out or something. But if this is a phenomenon that happens, it's not normal until it just happens. It happens sometime during the tribulation period. So that, again, pushes the rapture and stuff much back closer to us. So let's look at this then. So what happens then during the tribulation period? Just we're able to pinpoint that. This, and again, this may be a little odd, maybe it's a little off. It says a 1-year-old children will begin to speak and by uttering their voices. Now, 2-year-old kids begin to speak. I don't know any 1-year-old, but again, that would indicate if we have this concept of lifespans, and if we've went from graying at 50 to graying at 20, and went from living to 90 to maybe 40, and went from puberty being 13 or 14 to maybe 9, and 1-year-old children speaking instead of 2-year-old children speaking. It just maybe. Anyway, pregnant women will give birth prematurely at 3 and 4 months. So the way that's said, it's like 3 complete, beginning of 4. So it's actually 4 months. Again, 5 months is a pretty safe bet. If you have a premature child at 5 months, it's fine. But still, the normal is still 9 months. So since you're talking about 1-year-old children and this and other things, it sounds more like a aging thing. Now, one of the things that happens, and I thought this was pretty interesting, with aging and everything. Well, let's see if we get to it. So children begin to speak earlier. Women give birth prematurely, but it's like in half. Okay. But babies will live and be raised up. So we can't do that yet. But who knows? Tomorrow there could be a breakthrough. I remember even a decade or so back, well, it's been more like 2 decades. Anyway, 7 months was pretty safe, but if you were born at 6 months, you might survive, but no. And now it was 5 months, you might survive. 6 months, pretty safe bet. 5.5 now is, unless there's a problem, fairly safe bet. But the lungs is the main problem. They have to breathe somehow. Something has to breathe for them through the lungs that aren't quite ready to do that, umbilical cord, something. So if you have some sort of a incubator type thing that you could have some sort of breathing apparatus go through the umbilical cord, it just has not been invented yet. So maybe we'll see something like that. Keep an eye out for that. So that would be interesting. That would be the most logical step, because you can only have a baby breathing when he has lungs that work. And if lungs flat don't work until this stage, you can't survive, but somehow they do. So again, something with the genetics, he grows up quicker, but this does say premature. So it's an interesting one. And then the fields are found unsown. Something with the food in the fields are not being pollinated properly anymore. Something's messed up with the food. I was at church this last Sunday talking with a guy who the last 3 or 4 years, he always plants stuff. He's not a farmer, but he's got like an acre or so, and he plants different things. And he said the last 2 or 3 years he's planted stuff. He gets great looking flowers. He waters them. They all do good, but no fruit. And it dawned on him, the type of stuff he was planting, you need the bees to cross-pollinate. And they're just flat, wherever he's at, there just aren't any more bees. They're just not around anymore. So something is killing off some of the bees. So again, that in itself could just be bees migrating somewhere else. One thing, there could be a lot of excuses or reasons for it, but this seems to be a consistent pattern, which I thought was interesting. But now we go on down. Thought we had other. Okay, let me see where that other one is at. I want to show you. Oh, that's in another thing. Okay, and then he ends by talking about concentrating on the prophecy, not in the past, not what happened in the past, but what's the Lord going to do in the future. Okay, so with that in mind, let me hop over to, here's the Book of Jubilees. Now, this is from the Ethiopic, so again, it might be a little off too, but it's until we find an entire book of it complete in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the best we have. So anyway, when we get to chapter 23, let me just see if I can get there real quick. 23, here we go. And starting in verse 9, okay, lifespans decrease and corruption increases. So this is another book telling us basically the same thing. So it says, for the days of the forefathers of their life, we're talking about, were 19 jubilees. Okay, so 20 jubilees, a jubilee is 50 years, 10 would be 500. So is that like 1,000 or is that 2,000? No, it'd be 1,000. That's right. Yeah. Anyway, so in other words, remember they lived to be 900-ish. So that's the better part of 1,000. So our forefathers pre-flood lived to be around 1,000, 19 jubilees sometimes. After the flood, they began to grow less than 19 jubilees. Okay, they decreased in jubilees and began to grow old quickly. That's pretty interesting. Now, no prophecy yet. This is just historical fact, according to what they're saying, according to Genesis. And to be full in their days by reason of manifold tribulation and the wickedness of their ways, except for Abraham, who was perfect. Now, at this point, remember, Moses lived to be about 120. Abraham, it seemed to be pretty good, but Abraham lived to be 175. So he was old for that generation. He did a good job. But we begin to age. Nothing about graying yet, but aging. And the aging process creates problems. It's not like you live to be 100 and then one day just keel over because you die, old age, heart attack or something, and that's it. That would be nice. But some of us linger for 5 years or a decade, sometimes in pain, or can't walk, or just all sorts of weird. Maybe we can walk, but it's really difficult and can't breathe, or just all sorts of stuff. So lots of problems. It didn't used to be like that. You lived and then it was about your time and you could tell something's wrong. And many of the patriarchal writings, they call their sons together and say, I can tell it's my time. Things are shutting down. So I want to tell you something. And they spend the day talking to their kids, and that night they go to sleep and they just don't wake up. I mean, you can tell when you're dying. But right before that, I mean, you might need help to get up and walk. You're 120, or 130, like the 12 sons. So it's just different. The older we get in the ages, it just problems. I don't have to tell you guys that. So it happens. So, and I've got a note here comparing it to 2 Ezra 5. Same thing about growing less and less, similar idea. Okay, it says, for Abraham was perfect in all his deeds with the Lord and well-pleasing in righteousness all the days of his life. So you think he would be fine. But look what it says. Behold, he was not complete, or he did not complete 4 jubilees. He didn't make it to 200. He actually only made it to 175, according to Genesis. When he had grown old, or then he had grown old by reason of the wickedness of the fullness of his days. So he was righteous and he lived longer than normal people, but he didn't make it to as far as what he could have because of the wickedness of his generation. Now, we always think of that as a judgment of God or something. It's just, I'm done, wipe out everybody on the mountain or something. And it's hard to say what it was. But there is, I don't think we'll get to it tonight, but there is a prophecy about, well, we'll get to it probably next week in this study. There's a prophecy that talks about, oh yeah, we should get to it here. Because of the wickedness of our age, something happens. This is interesting. Let's go ahead and finish this. So, all the generations which arise from this time until the day of the great judgment will grow old quickly before they complete 2 Jubilees. So it gets bad. Everybody's living to 120, 135, but it gets bad enough to where we don't even live 2 Jubilees. We don't even live 100 years. And again, 90 is about the best we can do. 80 is kind of average. If you've got good health and you eat right and take care of yourself and stuff like that. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about make sure that you're not obese because that'll really shorten your lifespan. They did talk about what they did. They described a practice they did, which sounds a lot like intermittent fasting. And then we have a few things. We know they were Jewish, so we know that they ate the Passover lamb. So they were not vegetarians, as some people try to tell us. And of course, during the rituals, you have to drink wine. So they did drink moderately alcohol. So we just know a few things about their diet. So probably lots of fish, lots of vegetables, some sort of herbal medicine, a little bit of wine, meat for sure, fish and meat, intermittent fasting, things like that. So a lot of little clues. But okay, so we get down to not even completing 100 years. Their knowledge will force. Now look at this. When we get toward the end of time, which should be about now, one of the signs is we start living less and less, and their knowledge will forsake them by reason of their old age, and all of their knowledge will vanish away. Now, we've always had older people. There's a legal term that was back 50 to 100 years ago, an old man in dotage, meaning an old man that can't actually take care of himself anymore. He just doesn't quite have it. That does happen occasionally, and he's supposed to be taken care of by his family. But most people are pretty decent. Some of them are smart as a whip, as they say, all the way until they die. But it's normal, and I do this now at 55. I'll be like, we went to, the place with the hamburger for lunch, and then I'll finally remember it. And they tell me that's not Alzheimer's because I eventually remember it. It's just I'm old, and it takes time to get from point A to point B. So I tend to forget stuff, but I always remember it later. So that's not what we're talking about. That's kind of normal. In this case, one of the signs is that we have this very strange, complete memory loss. And if we're close to the rapture, second coming deal, and this is getting close to our time period, it sounds like Alzheimer's. And that's what I have written in here. But let's go on with this. This is interesting. And in those days, if a man live a jubilee and a half, so 50 and a half, it'd be 74, 75. If you make it to 74 at that point, they will say regarding him, he's lived long, and greater part of his days are in pain and sorrow and tribulation with no peace. And then it's got some other stuff here, but let me get down to verse 25. Because we're going on. So there's other messianic prophecies, but one of the other ones I wanted to show you. Verse 25. Okay. And the heads of the children, and that would be a non-adult, so that could be anywhere from 18 to 21 or wherever, or possibly 12 if you're thinking Jewish, rabbinic, but somewhere in that neighborhood. The heads of all the children will be white with gray hair, rather. And A child of 3 weeks shall appear. That could be 3 weeks, like 3 weeks old, or it could be Shemitahs. So could be the concept of 21 years. So a child is still a non-adult necessarily at 21 will appear like an old man of 100 years. So it's not necessarily a baby per se, but even at that, just thinking 21, I'm gray and I look like in the old times what someone of 100 would look like. Now we're told in Isaiah during the kingdom age, apparently that's restored. And if someone dies less than 100, it's like they died in their infancy. It's like, what happened to him? Why did he die that early? So things are reversed during the millennial reign. Anyway, and then there's a whole bunch of other things in here also, but I just wanted to kind of bring that out to you. So the points are, let me go over to here so I can remember this. Because of the, as it says in there, because of the greed, not greed, but the wickedness of our generation. Same thing, same reason why Abraham didn't make it to 200. He died at 175. I don't know if they fed him bad food or what, but somehow the wickedness of the generation kind of shrunk it down. So we have these ideas then that apparently during the tribulation period, something bad really happens, and like a plague or something that messes up the genetics. Or we talk about genetic tampering that they're beginning to experiment now with and have been for the last 10, 20 years through things I'm not supposed to mention on YouTube or I'll get banned. So anyway, enough said of that. But possible different genetic things that may have some good points that cause problems. Something happens. And I could see us growing old easy, or in other words, getting sick and dying early because of disease. But I don't see us eating bad food and not just getting sick and dying from food poisoning or something like that, but all of that stuff, the graying early, the reproducing early, the giving birth early, all those patterns. And again, it's not just in the Ezra Apocalypse or even just in that and Jubilees. There's a few other texts. But it's just interesting to pull that together. And so if the ancient Essenes lived double the lifespan, even in the midst of their wicked generation, because of their herbal medicine and or lifestyle and or food and or exercise or, whatever. And all we know is they would have more exercise than most of us. Like I sit here and do this and study and write books. I'm sitting on my butt all the time. I should get up and move and lift heavy objects and get out with the fresh air, stuff like that, at least once in a while. And it's been, studies have shown that if you're sedentary, you work in an office, generally speaking, you live less than someone who does physical labor. Unless, of course, you go to a gym or something, something to offset that. People that are obese live less than people that are skinny. And that's one of the interesting things in there. Apparently, there's normal obesity and normal forgetfulness as you get older. And maybe we're more like that because we set too much or try to work too hard or whatever. But somewhere along the line, because of the wickedness of the generation, there is a new kind of forgetfulness we can call Alzheimer's. There's a new kind of obesity. I don't know what you would call that. But in other words, even if you tried your best to exercise and eat right, somehow it just doesn't work. And it should work. If you get to a gym or whatever, lift some weights, if you can do that, it almost guarantees to work. I mean, you're building muscle. Muscle destroys fat. It's got to work. But if it doesn't work, something's amiss. It's just not the way it's always been. And so we may not be there yet, but things like Alzheimer's and the obesity rates, they talk about half of everybody in the country is clinically obese or will be there in a few years. And the scrolls even talk about obesity shortening your lifespan. So that's just one aspect of it. If we could get back to normal. And so here's my thought, and I could be totally off. We're always trying to eat right and not eat the junk food, and that's got to help. We try to do supplements and eat the food we have, and that's got to help. And I'm thinking, I could be totally wrong, but I'm thinking that rather than the Essenes having a diet of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they never eat anything else, it's not that, it's that they eat the food that's set before them, as Paul says, but they also use their herbal medicine. Think about it this way. The Apostle John, I was thinking of this morning. The Apostle John, it says that he died during the reign of Trajan. Now, Trajan ruled from, I think it was 98 AD to 117. So assuming that John made it to the very first year and then died, he would have died at 99. Well, if he was not a child, but just even a 20-year-old, barely an adult, when he was with Jesus in 32 AD, 32 to 100 is basically 70 years. He would be right at 90. Okay, and that's, even though that's nothing for an Essene, he could have won another 17 years and been 110 or thereabouts easy as an Essene. But still, it's not normal when everyone else was dying at 60. He makes it to at least 90, if not 100. So that shows you he had the Essene diet. But here's the deal. He left and he went to Ephesus, and he used Ephesus as a headquarters, and he would plant churches. So he was constantly in the Gentile world doing their stuff. I'm sure half the time at least he was eating the junk food, the weird Gentile non-kosher, or maybe not non-kosher, but not good food. Sometimes you just flat couldn't find the type of stuff you're looking for. So it seems to me that he started the Essene diet with the herbal medicine, and then because of the ministry, had to eat just what was set before him, whatever. Okay, and this kind of stuff is not good for my sugar, for my cholesterol, but I eat what's set before me. But I also take certain herbal medications to kick my body into gear and make it do what it's supposed to pull the right vitamins and get rid of the excess sugar and the junk and make me healthy. Apparently, it seemed to have worked. So if you think, unless God just stepped in it and just made him live that long, which is a possibility too, but looking at all these little things, you have the consistent concept of living to at least 100. If you have the herbal medicine that the Essenes had, you use intermittent fasting, you eat as healthy as you can, and when you can't, you still use the herbal medicine, and somehow it kind of works. So that's really interesting to me, pulling all this together. So I'll stop there because it's 8, but this is just kind of a small thing. Next time we'll try to get together and look at some more things. I'll have some more scripts to look at. Because according to the manuscripts, Enoch, Noah, and Shem all had herbal medicine books. Solomon had a little piece of one. There is a very, very small piece of Solomon's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not enough to even get like one name of one herb out of, but just a little mention of something. At least it's a little piece of that book anyway. Let's see here. Yeah, and there's lots of other things too to look at. So we'll just stop there for the time being.